The night my life collapsed, it fit inside a single moment and a single $10 bill. I was 19 sick, barely steady on my feet, clutching a small worn bag when my father threw the money into my chest and told me to leave. My mother stood behind him, the door locked. Just like that, I stopped being a daughter. I walked into the cold with nothing but a broken laptop and a body that could barely hold me up. 5 years later, I walked back into their lives, but not as the same girl who left. Before my body ever began to weaken, before hospitals and bills and closed doors, my world lived inside broken machines. Most nights you would have found me sitting cross-legged on my bedroom floor with a screwdriver in my hand, surrounded by old computers people had thrown away. Towers with cracked cases, keyboards, missing letters, monitors that flickered like they were trying to decide whether to stay alive. I pulled them apart piece by piece, studying every loose wire and dusty circuit board as if they were maps leading somewhere better. I didn't have proper tools. I didn't have money for that. So I used bent kitchen knives to pry open cases when the screws wouldn't budge. I wrapped electrical tape around parts that should have been replaced just to see if I could make something work again. I wasn't trying to build anything impressive. I was trying to understand how silent pieces of metal and code could respond, react, and come back to life under careful hands. It felt like a secret language, and I wanted to be fluent. I taught myself programming through free online manuals that loaded slowly on our unstable internet. I would sit there waiting for pages to buffer, memorizing lines of code while the screen froze and refreshed. I read until my eyes burn. I wrote small programs, deleted them, rewrote them again. If something failed, I didn't see it as proof that I couldn't do it. I saw it as information, a clue. No one in the house ever asked what I was doing when I disappeared after dinner. No one knocked to see what kept me up past midnight. My time was invisible, so I used that invisibility to build. The first time my father Thomas noticed a circuit board on the kitchen table, he laughed, not cruelly loud, just casually, like he was commenting on the weather. He said it looked like a waste of time, something that would never feed a family. His words didn't come with anger. They came with certainty. And that certainty pressed heavier on me than shouting ever could have. My mother, Karen, barely looked up from folding laundry when she spoke. Technology wasn't a serious path, she said, not for a girl who should be thinking about practical work. Her voice was calm, measured, final, as if she were gently correcting a childish misunderstanding. And maybe that was what hurt the most. It wasn't that they were furious. It was that they were unimpressed. My sister Brittany never had to defend her interests. Whatever she liked was treated as meaningful without question. But when I tried to talk about memory structures or logic flows, the room would go quiet in a way that didn't invite more explanation. It invited retreat. One afternoon, my mother stood in the doorway of my room and told me plainly that girls like me did not belong in technology. She said computers were built for people stronger, more confident, more suited for that world. She told me to focus on something simpler before I embarrass myself. I remember nodding. I remember saying very little, and after that I stopped talking about it, but I never stopped learning. Instead, I made my passion smaller, quieter. I saved every small program I wrote onto an old cracked USB drive I found in a drawer. It wasn't much to look at. The plastic casing was scratched slightly loose at one end, but to me, it felt like a vault, a private archive of ideas I wasn't allowed to speak out loud. I hid it in the back of a wooden cabinet under textbooks and forgotten notebooks. I tucked it away carefully, making sure it blended into the background. I was always afraid someone would find it, assume it was junk, and throw it out without realizing they were discarding pieces of me. That USB drive held everything I was becoming. Sometimes neighbors would leave old machines by the curb ready for disposal. I would ask if I could take them. I repaired what I could without charging a cent. Not because I didn't need money. I did, but because the real reward was the moment a dead screen flickered back to life. There's something about that first glow, that quiet hum when a system boots up again. It steadied my breathing every time. It felt like proof that broken things could respond to patience. Those were the only moments I felt fully awake inside that house. When a device responded to something I had written, when a function executed cleanly, when a program ran faster after I restructured it, I felt a kind of recognition. Machines didn't laugh. They didn't dismiss. They didn't tell me I didn't belong. They simply reacted to effort with results. If I made a mistake, the system told me exactly where. No guessing. No subtle disappointment hanging in the air. Just information. Over time, I began to understand something quietly, and without drama, machines understood me in a way people in my own home never tried to. I kept going. I learned more languages. I experimented with different structures. I built small systems that no one ever saw. I studied how data moved, how memory was allocated, how logic could be refined. Every new file saved onto that old USB felt like another brick in a structure no one else knew I was constructing. There were nights I sat on the floor long after everyone else had gone to bed, surrounded by wires and open cases, listening to the soft ticking sounds of cooling metal. The house would be silent, safe in a strange way. No commentary, no correction, just me and the steady rhythm of learning. I didn't dream of applause. I didn't imagine proving anyone wrong. I simply wanted to understand. And maybe though I wouldn't have admitted it back then, I wanted one person to look at what I built and say, I see it. I see you. That never happened inside those walls. So I became careful. I became self-contained. I learned how to hold excitement quietly, how to swallow pride before it turned into something that needed defending. I built a silent world inside a cracked USB drive because it felt safer than speaking about dreams that might be laughed out of the room. Looking back, I realize how alone I was during those years. Not physically alone. The house was full of people, but emotionally, I was orbiting a different planet. Still, I never stopped, even when no one asked, even when no one believed, even when the only witness to my progress was a flickering screen in the middle of the night. Because somewhere deep down beneath the dismissal and the quiet corrections, I knew something simple. I belonged there, even if they couldn't see it yet. Not long after I learned how to live quietly inside my own world, my body began to change in ways I couldn't ignore forever. At first, it was small enough to pretend it wasn't real. A little dizziness when I stood up too fast, a tightness in my chest that felt like I just needed more sleep. My hands would tremble sometimes, but I told myself it was exhaustion. I believed that if I stayed quiet and kept moving, I could outrun whatever weakness was creeping through me. I pushed forward the only way I knew how. When my vision blurred, I blinked it clear. When my breathing turned shallow, I told myself to focus. When my legs felt unsteady, I leaned against a wall and waited for the spinning to pass. I treated my body like a glitching system, something that could be managed if I adjusted carefully enough. But then the fainting started. There was no warning. One moment I would be standing in the hallway, the next I would wake up on the cold floor with a bitter taste in my mouth and a strange pressure in my chest. Sometimes it happened in the kitchen, sometimes in my room while I was trying to sit upright. I would open my eyes slowly, already knowing what came next before anyone said it out loud. Another clinic visit. The clinic became a routine I never asked for. White waiting rooms that felt colder each time. Plastic chairs that seemed harder than the last visit. Forms that asked the same questions in slightly different ways. I struggled to answer honestly because I could feel the weight behind every checkmark. Every visit meant another bill. The envelopes started appearing in the mailbox more often. Thick ones, thin ones. They all ended up on the dining table like silent weights no one wanted to touch. No one said much when they arrived, but the air shifted. The sound of an envelope being opened created more tension than any argument. Paper sliding against paper, a sigh that tried to stay quiet, a pause that lasted just a second too long. Something in the house was no longer under control. My mother began avoiding my eyes. If I tried to talk to her about how I felt, she would busy herself with unnecessary chores. Folding clothes that were already folded, wiping counters that were already clean, rearranging things that didn't need rearranging. It was as if movement could protect her from having to acknowledge what was happening to me. If she didn't stop, maybe she wouldn't have to sit still with the truth. My father stopped hiding his frustration. He talked openly about money, about stress, about how tired he was. He said life used to be simpler, that everything felt heavier now. He didn't shout at me directly, but his words drifted across the room and settled inside my chest anyway. Every sentence felt like a calculation. I began to hear numbers behind his voice. Costs, appointments, time off work, medication, the quiet math of what I required. It's strange how quickly a person can stop feeling like a person and start feeling like an expense. Brittany didn't hide her discomfort at all. She rolled her eyes when I moved slowly through the hallway. She sighed if I took too long in the bathroom. If I asked her to lower the TV because my head was pounding, her fingers would tap impatiently against the armrest, as if my weakness were a personal inconvenience. Her irritation was sharp, uncomplicated. I could see it clearly. I was something she tolerated. The doctor told me to rest, not casually, seriously. He warned me not to push my body further. His voice carried concern that felt heavier than any diagnosis. But inside our house, those instructions faded quickly into background noise. No one adjusted expectations. The house did not slow down for me. I tried to follow the advice anyway. I spent more time lying still, staring at the ceiling while my thoughts refused to quiet. I listened to doors closing softly, footsteps passing my room, voices lowering when money was mentioned. Conversations would stop when I entered the room. I began to feel like a shadow moving between walls. When I filled out forms at the clinic, I hesitated at certain questions. How are you feeling? I never knew how to answer that in a way that wouldn't add more weight to the house. I didn't want to be dramatic. I didn't want to make things worse, so I minimized. I softened my answers. I pretended I was stronger than I felt, but my body didn't cooperate. The fainting grew more frequent, the recovery slower. Each time I woke up on the floor, there was a moment of stillness before anyone spoke. A quiet calculation. Who would drive me this time? How much would it cost now? I began to dread not the weakness itself, but the reaction to it. The envelopes kept coming. They sat in the center of the table like reminders that something fragile was unraveling. I would pass by them and feel my stomach tighten. Not because I didn't understand what they meant, but because I did. I wasn't measured by who I was anymore. I was measured by what I disrupted, by how long I took in the bathroom, by how slowly I walked, by how often we had to drive to the clinic, by how many bills stacked up before the next paycheck. Even when no one said it directly, I could feel it settling into the space between us. My existence had turned into numbers on paper. I started moving more quietly, speaking less, asking for nothing unless absolutely necessary. I didn't want to add another side to the room. I didn't want to be the reason my father's shoulders looked heavier at dinner. I told myself I would get better, that this was temporary, that if I just held on long enough, the house would breathe again. But deep down, something inside me had already shifted. The home that once felt simply dismissive now felt conditional. I was no longer the quiet girl with strange interests. I was the problem that had to be managed, the unpredictable variable in a system already under strain. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being physically surrounded by people who no longer know how to look at you without seeing a cost attached. It doesn't explode. It doesn't announce itself. It settles. And I felt it settling in every corner of that house. By the time my strength faded enough that I struggled to stand without holding on to something, I finally understood what had changed. I wasn't being seen anymore. I was being tallied. And even before anything dramatic happened, before any door closed, I could already feel the space beneath my feet becoming unstable. Not because I had done something wrong, but because I had become something expensive. That night, the air inside the house felt heavier than usual. Not loud, not explosive, just thick. Like the walls themselves were bracing for something none of us were willing to say out loud. My body was already weak from days of exhaustion. Even standing upright felt like balancing on something unstable. But I stood there anyway, holding myself together by habit. That's what I had learned to do. Stay quiet, stay steady, don't ask for help. Dad stepped forward first. There was no hesitation in his movement, no visible anger. His hand moved quickly, almost carelessly, and the $10 bill hit my chest before I even understood what was happening. I felt the thin edge of the paper against my skin through my shirt. It slid down and fluttered to the floor between us. "That's all you get," he said. His voice didn't shake. That's what I remember most. It wasn't rage, it was certainty, a decision already made. My hands were trembling so badly I couldn't bend down right away to pick up the money. My chest felt tight, not just from illness, but from something else, something quieter and more final. It was the sound of a door closing long before it physically did. Mom didn't argue. She didn't plead for calm. She didn't reach for me. She walked across the room, picked up my small bag, and tossed it towards my feet. The sound of it hitting the floor was louder than it should have been. fabric against wood, a dull thud. But in that moment, it felt like something heavier had landed. Not just a bag, a removal. Brittany stood near the wall watching. She didn't move closer. She didn't turn away. There was no shock on her face, no protest, just observation. As if she were witnessing something that didn't involve her, something that wouldn't follow her out the door. I looked at each of them, but no one looked back at me the way family is supposed to in a moment like that. Take it and get out. Don't come back. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The hallway felt longer as I bent down, slowly, careful not to let my legs give out. I picked up the $10, folded it once without thinking, slid it into my pocket. My fingers felt numb. Then I lifted my bag. Before walking toward the door, I turned just slightly toward the corner of the room, toward the place where something important still waited, the old laptop. It had been hidden for so long, protected, guarded quietly like a fragile secret. I walked over carefully, my breath shallow, my body unsteady, my fingers wrapped around its cracked surface, tracing the worn edges I knew so well. That laptop wasn't just plastic and metal. It held every program I had written, every late night, every small victory no one else had seen. It was the only thing in that house that felt alive to me. I slid it gently into my bag. No one stopped me. No one asked what I was taking. I walked toward the door without looking back. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of the bag, but because something inside me understood that this moment could never be undone. There are things you can argue about later, things you can repair with time. This didn't feel like one of them. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face sharply. It stole what little warmth I had left. I heard the door close behind me. Then, the lock turning. Slowly. That sound stayed inside my chest longer than the cold ever did. I stood there for a few seconds, maybe longer. The porch light buzzed faintly overhead. My hands tightened around the strap of my bag. I whispered something under my breath, a promise so small it almost disappeared before I finished it. Then I started walking, not because I knew where I was going, but because standing still felt worse. The street was quiet, dark. My body trembled with every step, not from fear of the night, but from weakness. I could feel my strength fading in slow waves. The bag pressed against my side, and I felt the shape of the laptop through the fabric, steady and solid. It reminded me I still carried something that belonged only to me. Eventually, I found a bus stop bench. Metal, cold, unforgiving. I lowered myself onto it, carefully, afraid that if I lay down completely, I wouldn't have the strength to stand again. I pulled the bag onto my lap and wrapped my arms around it. The metal of the bench seeped through my clothes, biting into my back. My breath came out in small clouds in the night air. I slid my hand inside the bag and touched the laptop through the thin lining. I held it the way someone might hold something fragile and valuable, because in that moment, it was. It was the only thing I had left that felt like a future. I leaned back against the bench, keeping myself upright. I didn't dare stretch out. I didn't dare get too comfortable. My body ached. My head felt heavy. The world seemed quieter than it had ever been. I didn't dream of home. I didn't dream of them. I slept, sitting up, arms wrapped tightly around the bag, holding onto the one truth that had not been taken from me. They had thrown me out with $10. They had closed the door, but they had not taken my mind. They had not taken what I had built in silence. And as long as that was still in my hands, I was not entirely empty. The weeks after that night blurred together in a way that made time feel thin and unreliable. Most mornings began wherever I had managed to rest, sometimes a shelter, sometimes a quiet public space where no one asked questions, sometimes a corner where I could sit still long enough to disappear. I learned quickly how to keep my head down, how to move without drawing attention, how to make myself smaller than the space I occupied. When you don't have a fixed place to return to, you start measuring safety in moments instead of locations. The public library became one of those moments. It wasn't warm in any dramatic way. It was just steady, predictable. No one cared where I had slept the night before. No one asked why my clothes looked worn or why I carried my bag so tightly against my side. As long as I stayed quiet, I belonged there as much as anyone else. I chose the same wooden table every afternoon. It faced a tall window that let in soft light, the kind that didn't demand anything from you. I would sit down slowly, unzip my bag, and take out the old laptop. The screen still flickered sometimes, like it was struggling to stay awake. I understood that feeling. My fingers moved carefully over the broken keys. I wrote lines of code I had designed in my head long before I ever typed them. Code felt more honest than people. It responded to structure. It didn't misinterpret silence. I worked quietly, saved constantly, fixed logic errors that had bothered me for days. Even when the world around me felt unstable, the structure inside a program made sense. If something failed, there was a reason. If something worked, it was because I had built it that way. That afternoon felt like any other. I was focused on refining a function, trying to make it respond faster, reducing unnecessary memory use. I didn't notice the footsteps at first. I had learned not to look up quickly. Attention often came with questions I didn't want to answer. The footsteps stopped beside me. I kept typing until I finished the line I was working on, saved the file, then another line. I refused to rush just because someone was standing there. A soft voice broke the silence near my shoulder. "What are you trying to make it do?" The question startled me. Not because someone spoke, but because of what they asked. They didn't ask where I was staying. They didn't ask why I looked tired. They asked about the work. I turned my head slowly. A woman stood there, her posture calm, her expression steady. Her eyes weren't sharp or suspicious. They were curious. That was the first time I met Diane Walker. She leaned slightly closer to the screen, not invading my space, just studying the code. "Why did you choose that structure?" she asked. No one had ever asked me that before. My voice trembled at first when I answered. I explained that I wanted the program to respond faster, to use less memory, to make something simple feel smarter without making it heavier. As I spoke, my words steadied. She didn't interrupt. She didn't correct. She listened. She nodded slightly, as if she understood more than she said. When the library announced it was closing, the sound of the overhead speaker snapped me back into routine. I began packing up automatically. That's what I always did, leave before anyone could ask where I was going next. Diane didn't step away. "Where are you going to work tomorrow?" she asked quietly. I kept my answers short. I told her I moved around, that I found places when I needed them. I didn't elaborate. Long answers carried too much truth. She watched me for a moment as if measuring something invisible. "Get in the car," she said. The words were direct, too direct for someone who had only known me for minutes. Every instinct in my body told me to be careful. I tightened my grip on my bag. My fingers rested protectively over the laptop inside. She must have noticed the hesitation because her voice softened. "You can sit in the back. You don't owe me anything." The ride was quiet. Tires rolling over dark streets, streetlights passing in steady intervals. I kept my bag close, my body tense, ready to leave if something felt wrong. Nothing did. Her house was modest, clean, quiet in a way that didn't feel staged. She led me down a narrow hallway and opened a door. A small room, a bed, a desk. "That's all you need for now," she said. I stepped inside, slowly, almost afraid to touch anything. Afraid it would disappear the moment I believed in it. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, not defensively but thoughtfully. "There is one condition." I looked at her carefully. "You start your program over," she said. "Not because it's bad, but because you deserve to know you can rebuild it stronger." That night, I sat at the small desk with my old laptop open in front of me, staring at a blank screen. The fear I felt wasn't hunger, it wasn't cold. It was possibility. And for the first time in a long while, that kind of fear didn't feel like something to run from. 3 silent years changed what people thought I could become. At first, survival was still the priority. A bed, a desk, a door that locked from the inside, that alone felt unreal. But slowly, survival stopped being the only goal. I began to see possibility as something structured, something that could be built line by line, the same way I had always built code, carefully, deliberately, without noise. I spent long nights in that small room with cheap lighting and old furniture, staring at the screen until my eyes burned. Not because I was chasing success, not because I wanted recognition. I needed to prove to myself that my mind still worked, that even when my body had once felt fragile, my thinking was still sharp. I started developing software design specifically for small businesses that were struggling to keep up with their own operations. I focused on systems that reduced waste, organized scattered data, and helped owners see where they were losing time or money without realizing it. I didn't try to build something flashy, I built something useful, and I watched it work. Small stores that once operated in chaos began shifting into structure. Inventory errors dropped, scheduling improved, expenses became visible instead of mysterious. I saw business owners relax in ways they hadn't before. Not because I had changed their lives dramatically, but because I had given them clarity. For the first time, I felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with being tolerated. As my confidence grew, I began designing something more complex. A separate algorithm that analyzed financial data patterns and predicted risk long before problems surfaced. It wasn't emotional. It didn't guess. It studied trends, irregularities, structural weaknesses. It highlighted instability before it became collapse. I built it quietly. When the time came, I sold the rights to that system without announcements or attention. No press releases, no celebration. I didn't trust attention yet, but the contracts were real. The deposits in my account were real. And for the first time, stability wasn't theoretical. It was measurable. That was when I was introduced to Mark Reynolds, my legal advisor. Mark was calm, direct, precise with his words. He didn't treat me like a curiosity or a charity story. He treated me like someone who needed to protect what she had built. He reviewed every document I signed, every clause, every agreement. He He explained risk without exaggeration and opportunity without temptation. With his guidance, I stopped making decisions based purely on instinct. I began thinking in terms of longevity, ownership, structure. I learned how to protect intellectual property, how to separate personal assets from corporate ones, how to sign something without surrendering control. I wasn't chasing headlines, I was building foundations. Eventually, I became part of a small, independent technology group. It wasn't flashy. There were no dramatic launches or public announcements. The group was disciplined, focused, and intentional. We believed in constructing something slowly rather than chasing trends. I learned how to collaborate without losing myself in the process. How to defend my ideas without raising my voice. How to listen carefully and adjust when necessary, without compromising the core of what I was building. The contracts that followed grew larger. Companies that would have ignored someone like me years earlier began requesting my work. They didn't know my history. They didn't care about my past. They saw results, efficiency, accuracy, systems that worked. Each signed agreement shifted the quiet math of my life. Fear was replaced with planning. Fragility was replaced with structure. I made sure my heart stayed steady. I reminded myself often that control and arrogance are not the same thing. What I felt wasn't superiority, it was calm awareness. A steady understanding that I no longer needed permission to exist in rooms that once would have felt unreachable. Over time, my financial position moved from fragile to solid, from solid to strong. Then something changed again. Private financial invitations began arriving. Quiet communications, closed opportunities. I was qualified on paper and, in fact, to participate in asset auctions that were never publicly advertised. These weren't dramatic events. They were silent rooms, controlled spaces, careful transfers of ownership that happened without spectacle. I entered those spaces not with hunger, but with clarity. I didn't feel revenge rising in me. I didn't feel loud satisfaction about how far I had come. What I felt was control, the kind I had never known growing up. The kind that doesn't demand attention because it doesn't need validation. I signed agreements in quiet conference rooms. I reviewed data before making decisions. I studied risks before committing capital. Every move was deliberate. Every choice was considered. By the end of those 3 years, I wasn't surviving anymore. I wasn't defined by what I had lost. I was building inside the reality of what I had earned. And for the first time in my life, the ground beneath my feet felt stable. Not because someone else allowed it, but because I had constructed it myself. Brittany never thought of herself as reckless. In the house, she had always been the bright one, the visible one, the daughter whose choices were indulged because they seemed to promise something: status, connections, admiration. Spending felt natural to her, almost expected. The script makes clear that the purchases began as ordinary luxuries: designer bags, high-end gadgets, boutique clothing, nights out that blurred into mornings. Nothing looked catastrophic in isolation. Each swipe of a card was small enough to excuse. But patterns have weight. What began as lifestyle spending gradually turned into dependency on credit. When limits tightened, new accounts appeared, promotional offers, deferred payment plans, lines of credit justified as temporary bridges. The script emphasizes that she did not frame it as debt. She framed it as momentum. The future would absorb it. Something better would happen before consequences arrived. The parents never questioned the signatures placed before them. Thomas, accustomed to believing in paperwork without reading it, deeply signed where Brittany pointed. Karen trusted the tone of reassurance more than the content of the documents. The forms were presented as harmless consolidations, restructuring tools, short-term refinancing to simplify finances. Their names were attached without suspicion. In reality, those documents restructured ownership. Collateral shifted quietly. Assets were leveraged. The house, solid, familiar, unquestioned, became part of a guarantee buried in clauses no one read carefully. The script does not dramatize a single explosive mistake. Instead, it shows a slow tightening, interest accumulating, payment schedules overlapping, minimum balances masking deeper deficits. Then the freeze. Accounts that had always functioned simply stopped responding. Cards declined, transfers stalled, online access returned error messages instead of numbers. At first, the reaction inside the house was confusion, a technical issue perhaps, a temporary hold. It was not temporary. Official notices followed formal language stamped in impersonal ink. Default warnings, acceleration clauses, demands for immediate repayment of sums that dwarfed anything they could produce. Tomas moved from irritation to alarm. Karen reread the letters as if repetition might alter their meaning. Brittany insisted there must be a mistake, some clerical misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding. The script describes the shift in the house as abrupt and destabilizing. Phone calls filled the air. Legal terminology replaced everyday conversation. The same dining table that had once hosted celebrations now held stacks of documents, each one a reminder that control had slipped quietly away. When the accounts were formally frozen, it was no longer abstract. Mortgage payments could not be made. Lines of credit were called in. The lenders initiated enforcement procedures with procedural calm. The house entered the forced sale process, not with drama, but with inevitability. Outside their awareness, the listing moved through investor systems. Properties flagged under distress, automatically populated databases, monitored by acquisition groups and private buyers. It was one more asset in a long queue of troubled holdings. Brooke saw it there. The script frames this moment not as shock, but as recognition. She was reviewing portfolios, routine, detached, analytical, when the address appeared on her screen. The numbers aligned first, then the street name, then the image loaded. Her childhood home. There is no immediate surge of emotion described. Instead, a narrowing, a stillness. She studies the listing as she would any other asset valuation metrics: lien position, outstanding obligations, projected recovery percentages. The financial structure behind the collapse is visible to her in ways it had never been visible to them. Symmetry settles quietly over the moment. Years earlier, she had stood in front of that house with $10 in her hand, reduced to a liability in their eyes. Now, the property itself is reduced to numbers inside a system. She understands completely. The same house that had once expelled her is now categorized as distressed inventory. The script emphasizes emotional distance. Brooke does not gloat. She does not rush. She does not intervene impulsively. She closes the file, reopens it, confirms the data. Calm verification replaces sentiment. Her control is internal and precise. The legal notices that had terrified her parents appear to her as predictable outcomes of contract structures. The freezing of accounts reads as procedural enforcement. The forced sale is simply the next logical step in a chain of signatures they never fully examined. There is no triumph in her reflection, only clarity. She recognizes the architecture of their collapse because she now builds systems that anticipate such collapses. She understands how unsecured spending cascades into leverage, how leverage attaches to assets, how default triggers transfer. What felt to them like sudden catastrophe appears to her as cumulative consequence. The house sits in the database, stripped of memory, labeled by case number and valuation band. Brooke studies it one final time before moving to the next file. The recognition lingers, but it does not destabilize her. If anything, it reinforces the distance between who she was inside those walls and who she has become outside them. The symmetry is complete, but quiet. Once she had been treated as the financial burden, now the house itself is the burden, and she is no longer inside it. The private auction concludes without spectacle. The room is controlled professional glass walls, a long conference table, muted voices. Bidders speak in measured increments. Brooke does not. Her offer has already been positioned, strategically placed through the proper channels. It stands. When the outcome is confirmed, there is no applause, only paperwork. At the conference table, folders are aligned with quiet precision. Mark Reynolds sits beside her, not speaking much, but present, steady, a legal anchor. Across the table, Thomas and Karen look smaller than she remembers. Brittany's composure has thinned into visible strain. They do not recognize it at first. The documents are turned toward them. Buyer information, acquisition entity, then the line with her name. The shift is immediate. Confusion fractures into recognition. Thomas reads it again as if repetition might change the letters. Karen's voice breaks. First questions, then please. Brittany stares, searching Brooke's face for something familiar, something soft enough to undo what's already done. Brooke does not raise her voice. She does not list grievances. She does not remind them of $10 or a night in the cold. Her expression remains level, almost gentle in its restraint. Mark slides the final page forward. She signs. The pen moves smoothly. No hesitation, no tremor. What transfers in that moment is not revenge, it is ownership of property, of narrative, of self. When she stands, she offers nothing theatrical, only a quiet truth carried in her posture. Value is not assigned by dismissal. Identity is not erased by rejection. And self-protection, once learned, does not require apology. Then she walks away. Sometimes the strongest response isn't loud, it's steady. Brooke didn't chase revenge. She chose dignity. She chose boundaries. She chose to protect the part of herself no one else valued. And in doing that, she proved her worth was never up for debate. What would you have done in her place? I'd really like to hear your thoughts. If this story stayed with you, stay with us. There's more to reflect on together.